The evening air was still, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and makes every breath visible. Valentine's Day was a few hours away, but the town of Larkspur was already draped in festive finery. Red and pink banners fluttered weakly in the icy breeze, and shop windows glowed with heart-shaped trinkets and floral arrangements. Yet, as Sarah stepped onto her porch, the decorations only made the emptiness of her small home more pronounced. She spotted it immediately. A heart-shaped box, too elegant to belong to a stranger, perched on the top step. Wrapped in shimmering red ribbon that gleamed like fresh blood, it looked almost alive in the faint porch light. A small tag dangled from the bow, but the writing was unfamiliar, an elegant script spelling her name. Sarah glanced around. The street was silent, the kind of stillness that feels heavy. The glow of her neighbor's living room lights was the only sign of life. Slowly, she crouched down to examine the box. It was cold to the touch, heavier than she expected. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. "Hey, Karen," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light as she answered her sister's call. "Did you get it?" Karen asked, excitement bubbling over the line. "Get what?" Sarah replied, her eyes flicking back to the box. "Oh, nothing," Karen said quickly, though her tone betrayed her mischief. "I just wanted to check in. You sounded off earlier." "I'm fine," Sarah lied, tracing the ribbon absently. "But I'll call you later." As she hung up, the silence returned, more oppressive than before. Her fingers hesitated on the bow. Something about the box made her reluctant to open it, yet she felt compelled to know what was inside. When the ribbon came undone, it slid from the box with a soft hiss. Sarah's breath caught as she lifted the lid. Inside was a single piece of cardstock, black with faint gold lettering. "For the unfaithful, the heart collector waits." Sarah's stomach turned. Her first instinct was that this was a cruel joke. But who would leave such a thing? And why? She tipped the box upside down, but there was nothing else inside. No chocolates, no trinkets, just that ominous note. The sound of crunching footsteps startled her. She spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Across the street, a curtain twitched in a neighbor's window, but no face appeared. Shaking her head, she stepped back inside and bolted the door. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was an anonymous text. "Don't ignore the warning." The box sat untouched on her coffee table as Sarah tried to distract herself with a book. She kept glancing at it, though, as if expecting it to move. The words from the note looped in her mind, tightening her chest. "For the unfaithful, the heart collector waits." It sounded absurd, like something from a bad horror movie. But the message wouldn't leave her. By morning, Sarah resolved to get to the bottom of it. She wrapped herself in a heavy coat and scarf, determined to confront the strange events head-on. The local library was her first stop. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Harkins, raised an eyebrow at Sarah's request. "The heart collector?" she repeated, her voice a hushed whisper. Sarah nodded, leaning closer over the counter. Mrs. Harkins frowned, motioning for Sarah to follow her. Together, they walked to a dusty corner of the archives where the older records were kept. The librarian retrieved a thick binder and flipped to a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "Valentine's Day. Tragedy leaves town in shock." "Decades ago," Mrs. Harkins began, her voice barely audible, "a man named Andrew Cole was accused of breaking the hearts of too many women. They say he vanished one Valentine's night, and the legend of the heart collector was born. Some believe he became something else, a force that punishes the unfaithful." Sarah laughed nervously. "And you believe that?" "I believe the story frightens people enough to behave," Mrs. Harkins said, closing the binder with finality. Despite the librarian's dismissal, Sarah couldn't shake her unease. On her way home, she detoured to the town's historic rose garden. The space had once been lush, but time and neglect had turned it into a skeletal shadow of its former self. Now, the thorns were more prominent than the blooms. The garden was deserted, but something about it felt alive. The iron gate creaked as she pushed it open, and the cold air seemed heavier here, laden with a faint metallic tang. Sarah walked down the central path, flanked by rows of brambles. At the garden's heart stood a weathered statue, a man holding a bouquet of roses, his face carved into an expression of longing. The placard below was faded, but she could make out one word: Andrew. A chill crept up her spine as the air thickened. Whispers rose from the bushes around her, faint and fragmented, like distant voices carried on the wind. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped, but the oppressive silence returned, pressing against her ears. Sarah backed away, her pulse quickening. Just as she reached the gate, she thought she saw movement. A faint, shadowy figure slipping through the bushes. She didn't wait to find out. Back home, Sarah locked the door behind her, her fingers trembling as she slid the deadbolt into place. The rose garden's shadows still clung to her, seeping into her thoughts. As she set her keys on the counter, her phone buzzed with a new message. This time the text was different. A photograph of the garden statue. The shadowy figure she had glimpsed earlier now loomed beside it, barely discernible, but unmistakably there. She dropped the phone with a gasp. The fear she'd been suppressing all day swelled, tightening her throat. Her logical mind fought to rationalize the impossible. Someone's playing a prank, a cruel, elaborate joke. But deep down, Sarah knew this wasn't just a trick. Something unnatural was stirring, and she was caught in its grasp. Her resolve wavered as she retrieved the phone. Beneath the photo, another message had arrived. The collector comes for those who deceive. Her breath hitched. It felt as if unseen eyes were watching her, scrutinizing every hidden truth she had buried. The words of the text struck too close, tugging at memories she had tried to forget. 2 years ago, she had broken things off with her fiancé, Mark. On the surface, it was mutual, a practical decision made when their careers and priorities diverged. But Sarah had been keeping secrets of her own. She had let her affections wander during the relationship, drawn into a fleeting connection with someone else. Mark never found out. Or at least, that's what she'd told herself. As her thoughts churned, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, shifting with the flicker of the lamps. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Return to where it began. Sarah knew where it meant before she even finished reading. The rose garden. The air was colder than before, biting at her exposed skin as she approached the garden gates. The statue loomed ahead, its stony eyes glinting faintly under the moonlight. Sarah hesitated, dread curling in her stomach. A sound broke the stillness, a faint melody drifting on the wind. It was an old song, familiar yet warped, as though played on an out-of-tune piano. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice quivering. No one answered, but the song grew louder, coaxing her forward. As she stepped closer, she saw something new beneath the statue. A scattering of petals, red roses, unnaturally vibrant against the dark earth. They formed a perfect circle around the statue's base, pulsing faintly as if alive. A sudden gust of wind swept through the garden, carrying with it whispers she couldn't understand. The melody faded, replaced by words she could finally hear. Confess. The word rang out, clear and commanding, and the air seemed to thicken with expectation. Sarah's knees buckled, and she gripped the iron gate to steady herself. "Confess what?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. A shadow coiled at the edge of her vision, inching closer. The whispers rose in intensity, overlapping until they became deafening. "I'm sorry," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I lied. I wasn't faithful. I should have told the truth. Should have—" The whispers stopped. For a moment there was only silence, and Sarah felt a flicker of relief. But then, the shadows moved again, spiraling upward and enveloping the statue. The rose petals lifted off the ground, swirling around her in a storm of crimson light. The world dimmed, as though the garden had been swallowed by twilight. Sarah blinked, trying to steady her breath, but the scene before her was no longer familiar. The statue of Andrew Cole was gone, replaced by a figure standing in its place. He was dressed in antiquated clothing, a dark coat and polished shoes that reflected an otherworldly gleam. His face, though handsome, was unsettlingly perfect, his features too sharp to be human. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and resonant. "You have lied." The weight of his gaze pressed on her chest, as if it were peeling back layers of her soul. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "I am the heart collector," he continued, taking a step forward. The ground beneath him rippled like water. "I do not punish. I reveal. You have buried the truth, yet here you stand. Tell me, why should your heart remain yours?" The question was absurd, yet it felt profound, striking at the core of her being. Sarah's mind raced. Was he threatening to take her heart, her essence? "I made mistakes," she managed, her voice trembling. "But I'm not a bad person." The collector's expression remained unreadable. "Are you certain? Do you deserve the love you have sought?" Sarah hesitated. Did she? Her mind replayed the memories she had avoided, the moments she ignored Mark's calls, the lingering looks with another man. She had convinced herself she was justified, that everyone made mistakes. "I don't know," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm trying to be better." The collector raised his hand, and the rose petals spiraling around her froze mid-air. One by one they drifted toward her chest, pressing gently against her skin. "Your heart is weighed not by perfection," he said, his voice softer now, "but by intention. Do you seek redemption?" "Yes," Sarah said, the word tumbling out before she could think. "I do." The collector's gaze lingered for a moment, then he stepped back. The rose petals dissolved into light, and the oppressive darkness lifted. "You may keep your heart," he said, his voice echoing as his figure began to fade. "But remember, Sarah, redemption is not given, it is earned." As he vanished, the garden returned to its lifeless state. The whispers and shadows were gone, leaving only the faint scent of roses. Sarah sank to her knees, trembling but alive. The garden felt different now, emptier yet heavy, as if the weight of the collector's presence had imprinted itself on the very soil. The air, though still cold, seemed lighter, allowing Sarah to draw deeper breaths. She rose slowly, her legs trembling, and cast a final glance at the statue. It had returned, but its features were subtly altered. The longing in its stone face had softened into something inscrutable, as though the collector's essence still lingered within it. Her chest ached, not with pain, but with an inexplicable hollowness, as if something vital had been touched and reshaped. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. The relief she expected didn't come. Instead, a nagging sense of incompleteness settled in its place. The roses that had encircled the statue were gone, leaving behind faint imprints in the frost. She turned toward the gate, her steps unsteady as she made her way back home. The walk to her house was eerily silent, the night swallowing even the sound of her boots crunching against the icy ground. The town was still, its streets lined with darkened windows and faint shadows cast by flickering streetlights. Sarah's eyes darted to the side as she walked, certain she saw movement, just the faintest flicker, on the edge of her vision. When she turned to look, there was nothing. Her porch light glowed dimly in the distance, its warm golden hue a beacon in the oppressive darkness. She quickened her pace, desperate to leave the night behind. Inside, the house was quiet, but it no longer felt familiar. The objects in her living room, the sofa, the bookshelves, even the comforting clutter of everyday life, seemed wrong, like echoes of something she had once known, but now couldn't trust. The heart-shaped box still sat on the coffee table, its ribbon untied, its message etched into her memory. She stared at it, wondering if it had always been that shade of red, so deep it bordered on black. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she jumped. The screen displayed another anonymous message. "The heart speaks truth." The words sent a chill through her. They weren't a threat, but a reminder, a challenge. She sank onto the couch, clutching a throw pillow to her chest. The ache in her heart hadn't lessened. It pulsed faintly, a subtle yet constant reminder of the collector's presence. She closed her eyes, and his words echoed in her mind. Redemption is not given. It is earned. For days the garden called to her. The statue, the whispers, the roses. They lingered in her thoughts, invading her dreams. In these dreams, the garden was always alive, its vines twisting and growing, the statue's expression ever changing, as if watching her. She would wake drenched in sweat, her chest tight with the weight of unspoken truths. On the fifth night, unable to resist, she returned. The garden was as silent as before, the cold seeping through her coat as she stood before the statue. This time the roses had returned, scattered haphazardly at its base. "You said I could keep my heart," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "But it doesn't feel like mine anymore." The air thickened, and for a moment she thought she felt the faint hum of the collector's presence. She placed a hand on the statue's base, the stone cold and unyielding beneath her touch. "I don't know how to fix what I've done," she admitted, her words barely audible. "I don't know if I can." A gust of wind stirred the roses, sending a faint scent of decay mixed with sweetness into the air. The statue remained silent, but the oppressive weight she had felt since her encounter seemed to ease just slightly. As she stood there, she realized the garden had become something more than a place of fear. It was a mirror, reflecting her darkest truths and deepest regrets. She couldn't change the past, but the collector had offered her something rare, the chance to acknowledge it, to face it, and to move forward. The next morning, Sarah stepped onto her porch and found something waiting for her. It wasn't the heart-shaped box this time, but a single red rose, its petals vibrant and fresh despite the frost. A faint shimmer of light played across the dewdrops clinging to it, as if the flower itself held a piece of the collector's essence. She picked it up carefully, its thornless stem smooth against her fingers. The rose wasn't an answer. It was a reminder. As she closed the door behind her, Sarah felt a small shift within her. A flicker of hope, fragile but real. The ache in her chest hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer an unbearable weight. The heart she had reclaimed would never be the same, but perhaps that was the point. And in the garden, the statue watched, its stony gaze unchanging, as the wind carried the faint scent of roses through the town.